What's up, guys? We're back with another episode of our Wise Words book summaries. Now, if you've been tuning in, you would have realised Jes and I are big fans of JBP, that is Jordan B. Peterson, and we refer to him a lot on this podcast, so it seemed only fair to review his new book, 12 More Rules for Life, Beyond Order. Now, just like the last JBP book we summarised, we will also be splitting this into 2 episodes of 6 rules. That way we can cover all of it, but in sufficient detail. Now, these rules are, number 1, do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievements. Number 2, imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. Number 3, do not hide unwanted things in the fog. Number 4, notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. Number 5, do not do what you hate. And finally, number 6, abandon ideology. If you're a fan of JBP, and frankly, even if you're not, you're going to love this. If you do, you know what to do. Just click that little like button below and then do yourself a favor and subscribe so you can be made aware when we next bring out another episode. Now, with that all being said, here is Beyond Order.
Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life by Jordan B. Peterson.
Back for another 12. And we're probably going to do this in, another 2 bouts of 6?
Yeah, we'll start with 6 and 6 because usually
they're just
with
so
most of his
dense,
books,
you know?
yeah, exactly. There's such, each rule tends to sort of be relatively related to each other, and then they all kind of interlink with, I guess, the Peterson worldview in a way. That's the kind of the way I think of it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these rules also kind of relate to his previous 12.
Yeah,
like kind of the more like specific you go, or the more you dive into them, the kind of like crux is pretty similar to the other ones. You know,
yeah,
taking responsibility, all those kind of things.
Do not do what you hate, right? It's like, that's quite a big theme of his, isn't it? Because he talks about what I remember in 12 Rules for Life about not hating your kids or something. There's a chapter on it, wasn't it? It was something like that. Like it wasn't maybe that straight.
Don't let your kids do things that you hate.
Yeah, exactly.
Something
like that. And then another one that you got here is like, do not hide unwanted things in the fog. It's okay. But anyway, let's just get in. Should we just start with number 1 then?
Yeah.
So do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievements. I remember this one being the main concept or the main idea was that, you don't know why sometimes these social institutions exist, so therefore don't criticize them in the sense that you may be overlooking their importance. It reminds me of that. I don't know if you talked about it before in a podcast or if I've spoken to you about Chesterton's fence. Have I ever talked to you about that? It's like an idea that
rings a bell, but
don't pull down the fence unless you know why the fence was first there, like why it exists in the first place, right? And I think that is kind of the core concept of this chapter, is this idea that, we're trying with this modern age, we've had so many revolutions, whatever, taking place at the same time. Like he particularly focuses on stuff like Tinder, right? And he talks about the idea of the social institution of marriage, maybe less so in his book, but more in real life or like his podcast. And he talks about this idea that we attack these core institutions that have been, going through human society for, for eons is probably the wrong word, but for generations and generations. And we now have just decided, because we have this scientific knowledge, that we can just go, okay, all these things that were like almost religious in nature, which don't really have any scientific background, we can now just get rid of them because they're irrelevant, because, they're not scientifically provable, right?
Or we don't hold value to them anymore in our society. But
But that is kind of the crux of that. I don't even want to move to the next chapter unless you've got other stuff, but that was the crux of what I got from it.
I think basically it was kind of rooted in this idea that, your environment is always changing, okay? And so you need appropriate rules for the current environment, right? And what happens is people build these institutions one rule at a time, and then over time they might be like, oh, well, that rule isn't working for this environment, so we scrap that and we build another one. And it's constantly like this construction. You're constructing this kind of system, right? But a lot of the time, like he talks about, conservatives and liberals, in the sense that, you have people that really want to keep rules because of tradition. And then you want people who are like, well, it's time to change. You need both. like you need the perfect mix of two. And she was saying that like for someone to take into consideration both perspectives, it requires a lot of wisdom to know how to implement and go about it, you know, when to realize that, okay, this isn't doing us any more good. You know, it needs to be taken, or we should, you know, keep this rule because it's, you know, like you just said, it's been part of the foundations, and you don't want something attack.
I think sometimes we think, you know, classic like, oh, we don't need it. Like, we don't need this social institution. Like, why do we still have it? It's like a dinosaur. It's like a relic. We should move past it. But then a lot of the institutions came about because they were solving a specific problem, right? So the way I look at the sort of defund the police movement is a bit like, okay, right, so you're going to defund the only thing that protects you against criminals. It's like, why do you think it exists in the first place, to protect against criminals? And fair play, fine, maybe it does other things which it shouldn't. But, I mean, it does a pretty good job sometimes of protecting from criminals, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, talking to, I don't want to name names on these sort of things just in case, but, you know, our friend who's a policeman, he deals with people who are, I would never come into contact with in my life. Like the proper, I was going to say bad guys, but that's an understatement, really. But like, I was going to say scum also, that's also a really bad word to use. But anyway, people who you probably don't even think exist, but because we're protected from it by the police, you tear down this institution, you think, oh, get rid of it. Like, oh, we don't need it anymore. I'm sorry, I don't. It's hiding the problem from your eyes. And then if you removed it, you know, it would all come to light, right? And I think that was kind of his thing. We live in a day and age now where we kind of we're technologically advanced and scientifically advanced to sort of shit on our old ideas and old constructions or the way society is built, but we forget why it first evolved in the first place. Like even law, right? I get particularly annoyed, especially like when business and stuff, when it's like the law can be so specific about certain things and like contracts in general, and you read it and you're just like, why is there 50 lines of, you know, the same thing being really specific? And it's because you have to have something which can, you know, if you ever get into a dispute, resolve it. And people even criticize the law, and I'm happy to do it too, but it's like, at the end of the day, it's there to serve a purpose, and it's to serve the purpose of resolving disputes, right? And there's always going to be, like you said a minute ago, with this idea that, you know, things that worked in the past, and we need to have a mix of what worked in the past with like future orientated evolution to these things. But you can never truly just be like, all right, to completely get rid of that, that's a load of crap, we're going to do it this way. It has to be a mix of both, right?
And I think it's interesting because he talks about it like, as you grow older and you take on more responsibility and you have families and everything like that, it's nice having order, right? It's, if chaos occurs when you're just yourself, okay, you may be able to deal with it better, but once you've got other responsibilities, it's hard to take on this chaos. And so he talks about, like, you know, older people, you know, as you grow older, you're more likely to become conservative because you like this system that you've been like ingrained in for your whole life up to this point, right? But as people are born and then they grow older, okay, they might be in the system, but now they become aware. And so they're more likely, and they don't have as much to lose. And so they're more likely to challenge it. And so you get the young liberals, the young creatives that try to put forward new rule, like, you know, they put forward change. And sometimes, you know, these rules have been based on people who have been in the profession for God knows how many years. You know, they're knowledgeable and wise about this. And the young people don't have that yet. And so it may be warranted sometimes to challenge the things, but also, like he says, don't challenge it if, you know, you don't know anything about it, because you could be like breaking apart a system that is crucial.
I think I got two things off the back of that in my head. So what you were just talking about is a point you made on Fallen Leaves. It was, you know, the guy who wrote the short history. Yeah, that's the one. Because he literally had a specific chapter called on youth, and it was this idea that when you're young, you're way more idealistic. And when you see injustice in the world, you want to resolve it. And then he argues that the reason why you become conservative over time is because you slowly realize that it's a never-ending battle. This idea of resolving injustices / resolving evils, because it's too complex, there's too many variables, and you end up being more conservative because you start discovering evil and its permanence, possibly is the way of putting it, or this idea of a permanent sense of people who won't do what they're told. Therefore, you can never have this utopia, because the only way you can have a utopia is everybody behaved in a way that's predictable and integrated, I guess.
Well, you need an open communication channel, basically.
Yeah, but like everybody has to believe in the mission. Everybody has to. It's just way too complicated. And basically, his argument is, when you realise that you can't really get rid of it, then you become conservative, because you come up with you favour the side which realises that human nature won't change. And it reminds me of that Tom Sowell point, where it's like the two political views of the left and the right are just based on two different visions. The left is the vision of humans are permeable and can be changed and moulded into anything, and the right believe basically that human nature is constrained, and therefore you have to sort of create incentives or a system that stops evil or stops greed or whatever. Like,
it's kind of like nature and nurture, isn't it?
No, it literally is. One of them's like purely nature, but interestingly, the other side of it isn't purely. One is purely nurture, so left, and the right isn't actually purely nature. Right is more like a bit of both, if that makes sense. Like we are malleable to a degree, or maybe, but I'm sure there's far right. But then there's far right people who are eugenics and stuff, right? There is far right people who believe that everything's genetically determined. So fine, there is an ultimate other side, and also this is a complete gross generalization. And actually, I was going to mention that because back to this is he talks about this later about ideology, but like what's happened with this sort of stuff with social institutions is they become generalized into just the negative. Yeah, it's a really complex, multifaceted thing. Like for example, the police force, completely multifaceted. There's way more complexity to it than we could ever imagine. Like, there's people who have to like patrol. There's people who are doing the investigations. You know what I mean? There's people who specialize in the sort of law side of things. There's people who are doing paperwork based on what they do. It's not just like, they're all roaming around the streets. And, like, for example, with this Will Cousins guy in the UK who's obviously just gone and raped and murdered, right? But like, we then sort of generalize an idea of what the police force has become. Yeah. And fair enough, we should hold them accountable, but it's like you can't generalize from that one thing that the whole thing's incompetent.
Exactly. And there may be problems in the system that allowed that to happen, at which point that is a perfect opportunity for people to be like, okay, well, things need to change because this system has been rigid for too long and it hasn't been updated.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with change, right? It's just you can't just completely get rid of the whole idea behind it in the first place. And I do think, once again, it's such a Peterson thing, and it's such a you're saying something but you're not really saying anything. Is this idea of like you need that middle ground of change and also stability of the same, like the bridge between chaos and order. I love it. You use it all the time, but
you do. You can't get away with
it. In the sense of you want to build onto what already exists, and also make sure. I guess he always has that same point about like tyranny, about how if you leave something as it is, eventually it turns into tyranny because human nature takes over and like power and whatever and all this sort of thing, and therefore you have to keep it on check.
Exactly. I think you're kind of looking for the most sustainable rules, right? Like, how long has a police force been around for? I'm not just talking Scotland Yard, but the idea of like a protective system for society, right? You end up putting in laws or rules, and over time, certain ones prove okay and certain ones don't, right? So you probably keep the okay ones and get rid of the other ones. And it's constantly trial and error. And then you're getting, for instance, now that there is like a hole in the system that has come up with this Will Cousins guy, then you're going to have to go back to that level and then construct back upwards. But it's constantly like, you're trying to find the most sustainable rules, I think, in a sense. To have a sustainable system.
Yeah, I also do think that you always used to mention this a lot as well. Once you set up the kind of way things work in the past, it was set up for a specific purpose, and then over time you forget the purpose, and then it becomes just like going through the motions kind of thing. Like, I'm just trying to think of like another thing, like education as well. Like originally it was to turn people into thinking individuals, like a valuable person to society. And now you can argue that you're not being changed into that. You're being changed into like an automaton who regurgitates answers based on things.
I think a problem is when systems try to prolong their life just for the sake of it, as in rather than they don't have like a bigger reason. Like the whole reason, that all of these things should be rooted in. And once again, like, the left and the right is basically to create a moral society where we can all live and it's all, prosperous in a sense. Yeah. Right? Like that's kind of the main aim. That's the that's the road that all these systems should be pursuing. But obviously, over time, like you said, if you forget the real reason why these things are there in the first place, then you just try to make decisions based on sustaining the system itself, rather than pursuing, that moral direction that you were supposed to be going in. If that makes sense.
I do also think you make good points about this idea of like, this is where we can move on before it gets too political.
Yeah.
The overall society is heading, because of the capitalist underlying assumptions of acquiring money and wealth, push it towards things which aren't beneficial. So like the purpose of education has moved away from education to money. I mean, if you look at unis, the way they're structured, why did they all of a sudden all raise their price up to £9,000 apart from because it's trying to make more money? I don't know. You can always argue that other incentives can misalign people's purposes and all these social institutions, which is almost why we need to this is why I get people who criticize them. You're valid to criticize stuff if you think if these institutions, or however you want to call them, it's such an abstraction. It's hard to if somebody's listening to grasp what we're trying to talk about. I'm talking mainly here about stuff maybe even the banking system, just systems of society that have stood around meant to be to help us, but could possibly be hijacked by other things, or have come into disrepair in the sense that they're not living up to the purpose they originally set out to be. But then you could argue, like I was just saying then, it's been subsumed into capitalism in general, and then all of a sudden it's tainted. And that's why we should definitely criticize. The whole point of criticizing and being able to criticize is to make people realize they're being held accountable for not hitting the purpose or goals they should have.
Exactly.
But at the same time, not doing it carelessly. And that is his point. I think the point in the rule where he just literally has the word, do not carelessly. He's not saying don't criticize. He's just saying don't do it without actually having to think about it.
Exactly. What's the thing that he goes on about? Rules should only be broken when the rule is going against itself or the higher purpose for it. The moral purpose for it. If there's a rule in a specific context and it goes against the real reason for the rule.
Do you know what? I think that actually could be. I'm looking at these rules here, mate. I think that we could touch on that now, just because I have notes roughly on that as well.
He mentions a perfect example that he uses is Harry Potter. It's the reason why Dumbledore loves Harry Potter is because he follows the rules, but he knows when to break them because he's got a good moral guide, moral direction or moral compass in a sense.
Almost weirdly enough, he knows when they can be breakable because there's a higher purpose to break the rules, right? The point of the rules, I guess, with the Harry Potter thing is the classic thing when it's the troll in the dungeon, everybody's running away and he goes off and he does it. He's breaking the rule, but in the same sense, he's standing up to the bad person or bad guy or whatever.
Exactly.
And it's the same with all of the movies is exactly the same. He's always up to no good, but for the purpose of trying to save everybody, I guess. So,
and I think what's interesting, I don't know what rule this comes under, what I'm going to mention, but is this idea of the integrating the shadow in order to, I think it's later on, to be honest, and we can touch on that later.
It could be. Should we just, I'm just looking at these here, but it could be one of the last 6 rules.
Yeah, okay.
I think just for time, we should move on.
Yeah,
because, I mean, we've said what we had to say, in my opinion on that. There's not much more else. So
that's pretty much
number 2, imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. Okay. I think, first of all, this is a classic Peterson, so in the sense of it's, if you've read Maps of Meaning, haven't you? Or you've seen his framework, whereas you're here, you're aiming, there's only A and B in life, and that you're A, you're working towards B. His point in this chapter is work out where you're at, work out what you kind of want or where you're aiming at, and then single-mindedly, obviously, pursue that. There's not really much more to it than that. I think he was mainly in the chapter, he's trying to back up why it's a good idea to focus on one thing and not do many.
Yes, and kind of what you should kind of pursue. A lot of this, we're going to touch on morality fucking loads in this book because it's basically what he talks about throughout all of it. But I think one of the really interesting things, because he's obsessed with stories, right? And the idea that over the millennia, you end up having civilizations that construct stories that represent certain kind of abstract concepts, so justice, and that's embodied by a hero or something like that, right? Or a god of justice or a god of wisdom, these kinds of things. Now you end up constructing loads of different traits through loads of different gods. And this is polytheism, right? You've got plenty of gods. And then over time, stories occur whereby this god fights this god and someone, pursues. Someone comes out of it with even better like traits in a sense. And over time, you then up getting to one god. So it's like the movement from polytheism to like monotheism. Yeah. And all of those traits, it's basically just been like a time scale of trying to filter out which is like the highest pursuit.
Okay, yeah.
Like the best direction to go. And what is like Jesus basically is, the guy who's the most moral guy. That's why we follow him, isn't it? It's like, he stands for the most perfect man. So it's like over time, you've constantly constructed all these different traits and acquired them through stories. And stories have allowed us to kind of filter it through to like this one main story now, which is monotheism,
Yeah, yeah. He calls it the emergent ethic, doesn't he? Like the idea that over years we've decided upon an emergent ethical code, which we all agreed with. I quite like his point that, what's supposed to explain it? If somebody told you the 10 Commandments, you kind of get it. And his point being, if you can get it without having to, understand it logically, there's like a biological / emotional imperative to follow those rules to a degree. And the one thing I've always thought as a caveat to this in terms of like, the Christian ethics is an emergent ethic that, everybody wants to, or like that as a collective, we all agree are like a really good code of guidelines to live. The one thing I don't agree with is I think psychopaths don't care. Like that's not an emergent ethic for them. Therefore, it's not. Yeah. Maybe it's like a heuristical.
Although that would be explained by a biological difference, would it not?
Yeah, fair enough. But like that's what I'm saying. So like, but then that goes back to there's no moral code in general. Like the emergent ethic only exists for a subset of human beings, not all of them.
Yeah.
But you could say and argue that the majority all agree that those guidelines to live are pretty good.
Yeah.
In general, such as, do no harm to others, or what is it like? Don't harm others, or don't do to others what you wouldn't do to yourself. Yeah. Like, do not commit murder, all this sort of stuff.
I think it also ties kind of back into the shattered assumptions thing, whereby like, if you're those three main assumptions, what the world is beautiful, the world is benevolent, and the self is worthy, are shattered when you're younger, and they're kind of flipped around, then that creates, we've said this before, but like, most serial killers and people like that are people who were abused as like kids, right? Those assumptions are shattered at such an early stage. So it's kind of like nurture as well, in a sense that like,
Yeah. What in terms of like nurture being?
Well, if you're not in an environment that kind of, promotes certain morals, in a sense,
yeah, of course,
or pushes you in a certain direction, it's understandable that you will get some people that are already like maybe biologically on the edge, but then that kind of tips them over the edge a bit.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
But
I think that's kind of Sorry, go on.
The emergent ethic. I thought about it quite a lot, and I can't seem to like. I agree that with Peterson in the sense that I think over time people have come to an agreement on how we should behave based off, emotional reasons. Like the way I look at films, people can argue that there's a level of nurture to learn to care for people, but I'm not convinced that, sympathy, when you see somebody like being bullied on TV, I'm not convinced many people can side with the bully. I mean, people can side with the bully in the sense of, oh my God, he must have a really tough background, but nobody's actually rooting for the bully in that sense. Therefore, there's a collective, emotional, deep underpinning reality to that social interaction that you don't learn, if that makes sense. And therefore, there is an ethic built into us in a sense that we already know how to act to a degree, because when we see it, we have an emotional reaction to seeing it without even knowing why we have an emotional reaction to seeing it, right? Because you can program beliefs fine logically, but most of the time your beliefs are based on emotion first, right? The whole point of you emotionally react and then you logically rationalize whatever. But like, you don't learn logically that when you see somebody who's like begging for their life and then somebody like continues to beat them up, you don't learn logically that, that's sad. You are sad. So there is like, this is why I do agree with Peter in the sense, I think there is like a deep underpinning moral, but almost as like, if you think about it, it's actually just like a social glue that would have, we'd have evolved to be like, okay, we're going to defend somebody who's getting beaten up because, then there's going to be one less of us to help each other survive. And it's not worth killing somebody over this. But then equally, we are happy to be tribal and go. So like we are both sides of it. But yeah.
Yeah, no,
that was only my 2 pence on the emergent ethics. That's where I stand on it. I think there is definitely some biological, like, I mean, if you just look at most movies, they all follow the same kind of archetype structure type.
Yeah.
Even with most things, there's always like a kid being bullied and then he stands up and like that's like a revenge plot almost to a degree, or like a comeback plot. But people love that. So why do we always vote for the underdogs? It's the same thing. It's not something you learn to care about. It's something you care about already. Like, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the hero that emerges, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I'm convinced a lot of the Bible stuff actually could be, you could argue, is an exploration of our own. Like, basically, it pits together a story where people act and you try and abstract rules out of it. Like the Moses almost was like, the Moses whole thing was almost like an effort of like seeing good people act and all these moral tales and being like, right, let's just extract some commandments out of that from what we've seen or what we feel to be the correct thing.
Well, exactly, because I think you can only understand some of these concepts, that these are abstract concepts, by embodying them in a story. We understand stories because we go through it every day,
Yeah.
And so the idea that, like, what is justice? Well, someone in a story stands up for someone else.
Yeah. Like, scientifically define why that's justice, right? You just can't. Like,
you can't, because it's not relatable. Relatable is what your five senses and what you bring to it, to an event or an experience, and that's why we can understand stories, because that's what they describe. So when you're like reading some story about justice or some god of justice, something like that, you can be like, I can relate to that. I did that, and this is what happened.
Yeah.
And that probably emerges over time for us to understand these kinds of.
I think so. That's kind of it, and then it's just self-reflexive, and then you work out why, or like what rule has been broken to make you feel that way. Like, for example, a rule you could say is, if somebody is already down and beaten, don't beat them more, would be a pretty good rule for like pissing off the majority of society. Yeah. If somebody saw you beating up somebody who was like, why do people hate the fact that, like, let's just say some kid beats up an old person on the street? Why do they hate that so much? Because it's somebody who can't defend themselves. Yeah. And you're just exploiting it. And like, we have a deep-seated belief that is wrong as a collective. But then obviously you've got the odd people who don't. So there is the counter argument of that. But then you would say the majority do believe. But yeah, I think we kind of got massively off topic of that. So yeah.
I think the way that kind of ties in is just like, his whole point is like aim at something and pursue it single-mindedly. The idea that, like, do what you want, find what you value, go after that, and make sure that it's kind of congruent with your conscience and it's kind of like moral direction.
Like, he has a good argument where you kind of always know if you're doing something wrong because you feel it, and like that's like your inner instinct. Your inner instinct, which is like, telling you sort of what you believe almost. Yeah. Right, let's go to rule 3 then. So rule 3 is do not hide unwanted things in the fog. This is very similar to one of the rules in the first book, but I can't remember which one it was exactly. And this is to do with just like facing up to your because there was definitely one in the first book about like standing up to dragons or something, or or like don't let the dragon. I can't remember.
Something in the house, wasn't it? It was like.
There was one like keep your house in order.
Don't let dragons get too big or something like that.
Yeah, something like that, which is literally exactly the same as this, in my opinion, because the whole point of the fog is just ignoring things until they're too big, which the whole point of that dragon story was the kid was saying to his mum, like, Mum, there's a dragon outside. And the mum was just like, no, there isn't, until the dragon was so big that it, like, whatever, ate it or something like that. But she couldn't ignore it. And this is pretty much the same thing. I personally can vouch for this stuff in the sense of I notice stress levels personally go way down if I've got everything I need to do in a list or like, in front of me. Yeah. So like I find the type when I get the most anxiety / I think in getting things done, he calls it ambient anxiety, is when you've got a lot of things to do, but you haven't clarified exactly what they are. So they're like, that is literally what he means by hidden in the fog. Yeah. Because you haven't clarified things. There's just a bunch of random vague things in your head pulling you in loads of different directions, and they're hidden in this obviously fog of unclarification. And then once you clarify what you need to do in your life or things that you should do, that is getting them out of the fog into things where you can see it and then do it. Or that's at least how I took
Yeah, no, absolutely. I quite like the metaphor, to be fair. Just like you're going to be stumbling around, and if you don't figure out kind of what you want or try and get clarity on your problems or what you have to do, then you're never going to know. And it's kind of this element of like, well, plausible deniability. There's an element of you that doesn't want to know, in a sense, like what your problem is or what your weakness is, because once you know it, then you know that like you're going to suddenly be weak in a sense, or someone can abuse it and exploit it. And so, I think there is like a part of us that is like, oh, I don't want to have to take responsibility. I don't want to have to acknowledge that, because once I acknowledge that, it's always going to be there. The fog will never, mist it up again. And so I think like, it needs clarity, because otherwise you're not calibrated in a sense. You can't act in accordance with the world if you're just trying to like, oh, I don't want to walk there and I don't want to walk there. You're just refusing to go in certain directions.
I'm trying to think, because he gave some good examples of exactly what the sort of fog behavior kind of thing was. I specifically, when I was just speaking there, linked it to like being overwhelmed with things to do. But I think he definitely was more specific with like relationship based stuff as well. Like if you have problems with people in your life, like get out there and talk about it. Don't sort of, I don't know, keep it under the wraps and think it's all going to sort itself out kind of thing. I think a lot of it's to do with, if you need to say something, say it. Or if you need to do something, kind of do it. Don't just like pretend it doesn't exist to the point where eventually it comes back and bites you with vengeance.
Yeah.
I mean, an example of like revenge and sort of like, I would say like, but to be honest, I wouldn't know, but I could assume that the reason why, you get these people who go and revenge kill people from like petty grievances is because they've never ever expressed the petty grievance. So for example, if somebody slighted you in public, but they didn't even realize that you were hurt, and you don't tell them you're hurt, and then you just build up this massive pile of resentment in the fog, so to speak, because you never talk about it.
Yeah.
You then become relatively murderous or envious, or you end up channeling these horrible loops in your brain where you're just like, oh my God, this person's so annoying. Like they did this to me again.
Yeah.
Or like, and you haven't even spoken to them about it once. And this is kind of the point, is things need to be addressed and attacked and dealt with. And I think a lot of therapy is kind of that process, right? It's helping you. I mean, he talked about it, I think, in his first book, didn't he? In terms of a lot of therapy is about writing out or sort of formulating exactly, or clarifying is another word, like we were saying a minute ago, who you are, where you want to be, what the issue is that you're currently facing. It's just a lot of talking about and trying to understand why you think or why you're feeling the way you're feeling, kind of thing.
No, absolutely. Like, I think he also mentions that, well, because he was talking in relation to relationships or a partner, is that most of life is just everyday life. It's not a holiday every like 4 months. That's not what life is made up of.
Not like Instagram would let you believe.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's like daily stuff that you're going to do over and over again. It's routine. Yeah. Now, if you're living with someone, you have to integrate their routine with yours, right? In order to make the most efficient thing. If you don't kick up a fuss when a problem first, or you don't make it known when a problem presents itself, then it's going to accumulate. And it's going to happen over and over and over again. And the problem is that kind of resentment, in a sense, is going to leak into loads of different areas, and it's going to manifest in loads of different areas. And then that's why, like, people don't want to, when it's like 10 years down the line or 5 years down the line, they don't want to open Pandora's box, because now there's just so many things that they have to acknowledge. Whereas, like, it would be so much easier if they just talked about it straight away.
I'm convinced as well, like you just said, when it builds up and builds up and builds up, it actually affects your overall mood, and you become like a person who's just really grumpy and short-tempered and stressed, basically, and it affects every element of your life. And this is kind of why, if everything's in the fog and waiting to jump out at you, then you're going to be stressed at all times, because you don't know what you have to do, because there's too many things that are like pulling you apart, basically.
Not even jumping out at you, but like enclosing you. You're becoming claustrophobic in a sense. There's one thing that's get placed in front of you, and here and here and here, and then you have nowhere to turn, and you have
exactly. And everywhere you turn, there's something there, lurking or whatever. So it's a good metaphor.
Yeah, that's it. And then before you know it, you have to acknowledge that dragon, and that's
it. Who's been hiding in the fog.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all I have for that one, mate. So we can move on to the next one, which is kind of related. So rule number 4, is notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. I have seen a similar idea. I can't remember where. It was in a bloody business book or something. It was this idea that in a business, if somebody isn't taking responsibility for something within the company, let's say it was like a sales team and nobody was taking responsibility for the sales, the opportunity there lies for you to take responsibility and showcase your talents, because you're the one who's taking responsibility for a particular effort and purpose, and you reap the rewards from taking responsibility. And I think it links similarly to this, which is this idea that, yes, if there's nobody taking responsibility for a certain thing, there is opportunity for yourself to jump in there, take responsibility and develop. And because like from responsibility comes development ahead, because you're held accountable to achieve a specific purpose.
Yeah.
If you're responsible for something, you are responsible for achieving a specific thing, and therefore you can work out whether you failed or did it. And therefore you can adapt because you actually have a standard to evaluate yourself by.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
At least that's how I see it.
Yeah. And I think you're also attracted to it because you value that thing. Okay, in a sense, as in like where that responsibility has been abdicated, whatever kind of system or field that is within, the reason you kind of notice it and that you almost feel bad, when you feel bad that you didn't do something, or like you're part of a group project and something doesn't get done, so if it doesn't get done, you feel a bit like anxious about it.
Yeah.
It's almost like because you care, there's a higher value there. And that like, if you take that on, that's just going to make you even better as a person.
So there's an opportunity for growth, isn't
it? Exactly. It's like your body has this kind of ability, or your conscience or whatever has this ability to like guide you towards this kind of, I think we used to talk about this kind of embedded curiosity in a sense.
Yeah.
That kind of guides you towards like, this is where, if you go to this area, more of your genes are going to get expressed and there's going to be more growth. That's basically it,
Yeah.
Which I think is really interesting. And I think it's very much the whole chaos and order, the chaos is going into the unknown and taking on more responsibility. But then this comes back to the whole thing that I was going to mention earlier on, the integrating the shadow. If you integrate the shadow, you have a better ability to see in the darkness. Whereas other people don't, right? Like you can now relate to it in a sense.
Just to clarify for people who are listening, maybe never heard of the shadow. What do you mean by it?
So the shadow is basically like these darker aspects to you, or these like kind of repressed feelings or repressed thoughts, which everyone has.
Yeah. I was going to say the evil side of yourself that you try to not acknowledge.
Exactly. Yeah, and you can't make an accurate decision if you're ignoring 20% of yourself or 50% of yourself. It's like you can't make an overall accurate decision.
I was going to say as well, like, it's not even just that, is knowing that you have it in you means you can identify it in other people as well, so you just know that the world isn't just fairies and rainbows.
Exactly. And once you integrate that, then it's like the idea that, okay, well, if I know that about the world and I'm not just completely rejecting it, then I can go into the world and I can find those areas and I can take out the treasure there. The dragon is hoarding the treasure there, and I can take that back in a sense. And only people who are well adjusted, who are kind of calibrated and who can do that are normally the ones that benefit the most. And that's normally where like responsibility is, by taking on something else.
Yeah, of course. I was just trying to think about responsibility in general, in the sense of like what it actually means. So responsibility, because I remember seeing it in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, whatever. But it's like response able. If you're responsible, you're able to respond. I was thinking, so if you're taking on more responsibility, because essentially in my head, responsibility, or I guess you could use it interchangeably with the word accountability too, right? Because in my head, if you have responsibility or accountability, you are in charge of a transformation from A to B. Does that make sense? Or at least in my head, you can't not be like, if you're responsible for a specific task, you are responsible for doing the task from the beginning. to the end, right?
Yeah.
In my head. If you are responsible for somebody's life, you're responsible for making sure that the B is they're still alive. So responsibility is all about being the cause of A to B, or being the cause of transformation. And therefore, of course, the opportunity is always in that, because being responsible for transforming a life from A to B, that's where always the opportunity is, because that's the land of transforming yourself right now into something else, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I think.
So I was just thinking, like, if you're not responsible, then you don't have to do the A to B. Somebody else is doing the A to B and letting you do the bits which maybe aren't as relevant, but you don't have to worry about the A to B.
Yeah.
It's like me thinking from a perspective of like running my own business, right? I remember when I was working as an employee, it was so fucking great because, you know, you finish a day at 5 o'clock and you're like, right, it's not my responsibility to, you know, make sure that all the things are going well. Like the employees aren't like, you know, I don't need to care if the employees are happy. I don't need to care if we're making money as a company. I don't need to care about the finances or the bank. I don't need to do any of this. I just do my job and I walk out.
Yeah.
That's like not really much responsibility, right? And then there's the opposite of edge, which is somebody who has responsibility for everything. And that is where you grow, because you have to be the one who transforms the reality to what you want. Whereas the people who aren't are technically directionless.
Yeah.
Really, if you think about it. Because if you aren't the person who's trying to transform something to something else, you don't have a direction. You're just there doing the direction for somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you think about it, okay, like the idea of taking something on and taking on responsibility, whatever you're taking on or taking in has to be integrated to you. And so the literal idea of transformation is you taking that in, integrating it into yourself, and you're transforming.
And performing the transformation or the task or whatever. Yeah.
And that's the whole thing that he talks about with the whole, like, with the phoenix, you know, it dies and comes back to life, you know, because you killed your old self and then you integrated this new thing and you come back and it's the new you. You know, so you're constantly doing
it's in the phoenix. I like the idea. Like, so I used to think, oh, that's airy fairy. But if you think about it as the phoenix as a symbolic representation of what it's like to transform yourself as a human being, then it makes complete sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't know if you got this note. I had this note down. I think it actually fits in quite perfectly now. He talks about this idea as the cross as the symbol for the burden of life and carrying something. So like this idea that when you carry the cross, obviously you're carrying it to death.
Yeah.
You're willing to hold the burden of the weight, because that's what life is about taking responsibility and carrying it. Yeah. And it's funny because I'm definitely not a religious person at all. But then when you start thinking of religion in terms of symbols and actually deeper meanings, rather than being like true in terms of a scientific sense, but more in a metaphorical, symbolic sense of how to live a good life and stuff, I find the religion fascinating. You see it in a completely different way if you think of it from a not like trying to explain the world, but trying to symbolize things and bring out deeper truths that maybe aren't available through the methods of science, right? Like we said earlier, like there's no such thing as a scientific moral code.
Yeah.
Like, is there? I mean, I guess the closest you can get is to what I was saying earlier, where if there's an emotional reaction to something that's pre-programmed, you could be like, well, that could be the biological moral code. But anyway,
I think it's fascinating. Like, I find religion now really interesting because I think, you know, we're now understanding it on like a deep level, right? The meanings behind all the things that have been put in place. Whereas I think if you go back 10 years ago and someone asked me about religion, it's just thought on such a surface level. It's like, oh, you have to go to church every Sunday. You have to pray. And you have no idea why these things are there. When now it's like, oh, people go to communion. It's because, oh, you're with other people and you have shared experiences, so it makes you closer with people. Yeah. And praying is basically your conscience, and you're trying to tell yourself and put yourself on the right road and the right path and pursue those goals. Like all this stuff can actually kind of weirdly be backed up by like science when you dive into the like specific variables. But when it's talked about in a religious way and you don't have that understanding, it just seems like some weird ritual. And it's like, oh, I don't, you know, it seems so.
Yeah, a lot of the rituals are for social cohesion anyway, aren't they? They're like bonding and stuff like that. It's definitely, you know, I think Peterson's been, for me personally, been a big help into sort of actually viewing, you know, religion through a different lens.
Absolutely.
And, you know, thinking twice about the things I already knew. And this is kind of the reason why I quite like his content, is because it does make me rethink this stuff from a perspective that, you would never really think of, because I was always the first to dismiss any sort of religious-based, beliefs.
Join the club.
But the more I think about it, when you think about where these moral codes come from, it actually is inherently Christian, first of all. That's what we live our lives by. So
yeah. I just think it's funny that what we try to do now, right, is we try to convey a lesson in a story, right?
Yeah.
Religion is doing the same exact thing, but just in a massive story. When if someone was to talk to me about religion 10 years ago, I'd just picture a guy with a beard in the sky, telling you what to do. But realistically, all it is just one massive story that encompasses loads of real values. And it just tries to explain them that way.
Yeah, it does a bunch of stories which show that, for example, the Cain and Abel, it shows what envy can do, right? It kind of gives you the end game if you let it play out.
Yeah.
Right. And then from that, you don't I guess it does explicitly say in the commandments. And to be honest, I'm speaking from a position of ignorance here where I haven't even read the Bible, but my understanding of the Cain and Abel story is it doesn't afterwards go don't kill people or don't enviously kill people. I think it almost gives you the story, so it's almost self-evident that it doesn't need to tell you, why it's happened, right? You don't. No. It doesn't have to explain. Oh, Cain was really jealous. You see it from the way he was acting. So that in itself is quite interesting.
I think it's interesting when you also consider that, for instance, let's take the context with which the idea of revenge has been portrayed in, right? Mm-hmm. And the more kind of stories it's been told in, then you end up abstracting it into now it's the Bible, and now it's Cain and Abel, right? But the same thing could be applied to businessmen on Wall Street or this or that.
Well, the same stories play themselves out again and again and again.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I get that. It's the never-ending story of humanity. And
in a weird way, you could almost argue that
actually, it's funny you say that, because actually one of the things that I get most anxious about is when I realize that I'm a part of an archetype. When I realize that I have elements of me that are archetypal and predictable almost. It's quite, I don't know. Yeah. Have you ever had that before? And you're I'm living this out, and I'm this is just so stereotypical.
Yeah, so someone's there and Tristan speaks to Jes on a podcast, just
you are relatively but this is it. You can pick out specific aspects of you that are stereotypical, and then they're not, because they're an amalgamation of all of them, you are. But it's just, I catch myself sometimes. I'm just fucking hell, this is so you can stereotype me so easy, and it's just please don't.
Yeah.
But this is the problem of, I guess, humanity, in the sense that whenever you meet somebody, everybody's too complex to understand, so you have to stereotype them, because otherwise you could never get on with your day. Apart from the people who just go, right, nobody, everybody's just everybody else. They're not a stereotype, they're just them, and then evaluate them through that.
Yeah,
that's hard.
Wouldn't it be weird if someone almost, and it sounds like a weird concept, but if someone wrote an up-to-date version of the Bible, so all the stories are basically translated in a way that people would kind of more relate to them.
Yeah, get them
because you can't relate to Noah on a boat, right? But you could if it was something.
It's interesting. That's not a bad idea. You take the morals and you just recreate it in the modern world. I mean, that would probably go really down well in Broadway.
Yeah,
genuinely. That's you could do a musical, not a musical, but you know what I mean. You can you can turn that into something quite interesting.
Yeah, mate, 10 acts.
Genuinely, get that down script writing. I think that would go down like a treat if you reinvented the main stories. If you took the main stories and put them in a modern setting.
Yeah, because that's
you really see the differences.
I'm just thinking, if you, let's say you,
you really see the differences, if any differences. You might even go, fuck me, this happens.
but this
nothing's
is
changed.
Those stories, we do relate. If you're only relating to the kind of emotional aspect or that abstract concept a tiny bit, but if you can also relate to all the context as well, then surely that's just going to make it even more able to kind of be taken.
Funny enough, I would actually argue the least abstract thing is a story, a actual social interaction. We don't see social interactions as abstract; we see them relatively accurately, I think, in general, which is pretty impressive if you think about it. What was it? There was a really interesting study where it's they created some mathematical question, which is the probability of something, and it was all to do with numbers, right? And then they asked the same question in the form of a bouncer asking for IDs. I don't know if you've ever heard of this test. But
No,
they gave it a social context, and everybody knew how to solve the problem.
Yeah,
because it was a social context. But the moment it was mathematically represented, so like I'd actually almost argue like the core of human cognition is social, and then everything else is just abstracted out.
Well, he even talks about that, doesn't he, in the book? Because he talks about how our first kind of schema or lens is social, and so we look at everything through a social lens. Hence, why we anthropomorphize everything.
Which is almost why it's the story, like the narrative type thing, and the good and evil, because everything in social life is good or evil based on the moral code you have. Is that good? Is that good to do, or is that bad to do? It's almost like that is the framework you evaluate most things through.
Exactly, and we personify everything. We give the sun a face and the moon a face. We describe everything in terms of
and you give them
interaction. In a sense.
Yeah, you give them human motivations and human, desires and human characteristics, right?
But it also allows us to relate to things as well, doesn't it? If we know that everything else has a personality, like, oh, my toaster's fucking furious because he just burns my toast all the time. I can.
You get it.
Get it. So
it's funny. That's really funny actually. I like that. The furious thing, because you do get it. You immediately can understand it. You're right. Yeah. And
like when people write fiction and they describe certain things, and it was just like,
it's why they sometimes say like great literature in general actually is better than psychology books and understanding human psychology.
You just have to be good at abstracting in a sense, like what's the idea here. Should we move on to the next one?
Yeah, let's go, mate, because I feel bad otherwise. So rule for poor Jack. Rule 5.
He's eating there still, mate.
Is he?
Do
not do what you hate. So
now this is a good one, I think.
I mean, this one was kind of linked to the other ones in the sense of the fog, where it's like, or the single-minded sort of focus, where it's like you got to do what you want to do. But this point is like just genuinely don't do what you hate. If you end up at the end of the day feeling like you're being forced to do something, I guess you have to ask yourself at what cost. And I understand there's like financial constraints that some people, they can't just quit their job or whatever.
Yeah.
But the amount of people who probably feel some level of resentment for never following their dreams or trying to achieve their dreams makes it like, I guess that's what the main point here is if you feel resentful for your daily life, you need to change it. Yeah. Because like we said earlier with this idea of the fog and being like surrounded and just getting more and more anxious, that's what's going to happen if you just keep compounding the fact that you hate what you do every day. Yeah. Did you have any specific notes on it?
Just the idea, like, he talks a lot through this book about like conscience. And I think we all can relate on such a like deep level that we know when we don't like what's going on, or we're not interested. Like when your boss tells you to do something, I'm not saying don't do what your boss tells you to do, but when he tells you to do something and it's just something that you're so not interested in that it doesn't pursue you, don't have any motivation, no momentum, and you just it's just soul sapping. And when those kinds of things occur over and over, you want to try and like, it just brings you down. And it's so easy to then like, what was his other chapter in the other one? It's like, I can't remember what the title of it was, but he said that it's so much easier to go down than it is up. And when you're constantly kind of like soul sapped because you're doing something that you don't want to do, but then of course you're going to just rest on your laurels and you're not actually going to pursue anything. And so I think, it's so important to just kind of like stay congruent with your kind of conscience. Like don't do what you don't want to do, because you can construct your own life, and you can, even if you can't right now, you can construct a plan whereby you
fine. I think the argument is you could always, a bit like with the single-mindedly pursue something, it's kind of like you can take many steps every day as long as you figure out what you don't want, and then you try to start to figure out what you do want, and then start, I think I do want to say it cautiously where I say like, if you're busy, it's because you haven't made the time. Like most people say, I don't have time for that. It's because they haven't made time. Yeah. And I am aware there is obviously people out there who probably genuinely can really struggle to even make 2 or 3 hours. But I mean, there must be times on the weekend where they have spare time to start thinking about a plan to get out of where they're at. And we always...
or trying to refine the process.
Yeah,
we also make the same thing, but in a better way or a smarter way that reduces time.
We make like limiting assumptions, right? In the sense that, for example, they'd be like, I can't quit my job because of this, this, and this reason. Yeah. But they haven't even tested if those reasons are legit. For example, they might be like, I can't quit my job because my boss, if I asked him for a time off, he would just say no.
Yeah.
It's like you just assume that.
Yeah. Now,
fair enough. You go.
Sorry, go.
No, say, and then you go ask them, and then fine, they might even confirm the assumption. But then you haven't. For example, if you just go, "Oh, can I quit my job for a few weeks?" Or I don't know why I'm limited to this exact archetype, but anyway, I can't quit my. Can I quit my job? And they're like, "No, you can't. I need you for this." And then you can then be like, "Well, okay, well, if you need me for this, once I'm done, can I have time off?" Right? There's like many ways you can negotiate. It reminds me of like the I want to say it was Bezos, but it was somebody who was just like, whenever humans are involved, it's always fucking negotiable. Like, no matter what you think, whenever there's a human person involved in front of you, it's not fucking iron law.
Yeah,
you can't do something.
Yeah.
So and I now like sort of use it as gospel. Like, if you don't ask, you don't get. Like, genuinely, it's always the thing.
Isn't there like a massive fear about asking?
Well, of course, because you just assume rejection in advance.
Exactly.
And then also, like, you don't even realize that even if they're going to reject you, they're rejecting you for specific reasons in their head, of which, if you could understand, you could then be like, okay, well, I can address those reasons, and then they're going to feel comfortable for whatever you've just decided to let you do, for example, right?
Exactly.
Because you just assume they're going to say no. Fine, you were correct, they said no, but you now need to understand why they said no to realize how you can address the reasons why they said no. For me, it's I mean, even, for example, like, you go up to a restaurant. I give an example yesterday when we were leaving with Alex. She had her suitcases behind. We went up and we were asking, "Oh, can we leave our suitcases there so we go for Rwanda?" And they said no, because it's against company policy. But if we didn't ask, we wouldn't have got. Yeah. And against company policy, I could have been like, okay, well, who's going to know? But I didn't argue. But anyway, the point is, at least then you know, because it's the company policy, exactly. That is the thing you have to address now if you want to get past that hurdle. Yeah. But until you know what the hurdle is, and also, if somebody says to you no, you don't know why they said no. So that's why you got to be like, okay, well, what makes you say no, or like what would convince you otherwise?
Yeah,
or,
once again, it's that idea of like, you've got a plan and you're just making it more clear. You're trying to understand and map it so that to like what you want. And like I think also, like, he talks about in this chapter, do not do what you hate, in the sense of not just about business and things that you want to do, but as in like a moral obligation or a systemic obligation. If someone is forcing you to do something, stand up to it in a sense, because it's only going to get harder. Because the more you just comply, the less it's going to be. You're going to be likely to stand up against it once
in the future. Yeah,
exactly. And so you kind of hold systems accountable. That was, I think, one of his other points on like a more meta level. But because otherwise it just eats away at you, because it's not going anywhere.
You haven't seen anything else on this. Yeah, you're right. It does. It's just that classic level of like build up of emotions, or like negative emotion that eventually leads to an outburst or some sort of level of violence, because that's the kind of, I'm not going to say the original OG motives for violence, but it's not exactly conducive to manic happiness. You're not going to at the end of doing stuff you hate every day, you're not going to become the happiest person on the planet and go hug everybody, are you? Like, it just that's just the opposite.
And so, that's why it ties so much into that rule 3: do not hide unwanted things in the fog, because it's like, if you don't let your partner know what you don't like, then how are they going to know that you don't like it? And then you're just going to continue.
And vague comments which don't specify what the problem is aren't going to help. I quite like to. I think you might have made the point in another book. It's like, if you're ever going to say what you don't like, always give them like something that you do, or like something they can do specifically. Yeah. So don't just be like, I don't like when you do that. Be like, I don't like when you do this. Could you do this instead? At least then you've been specific of what you want.
Exactly.
Because otherwise they still have the ability to be like, fine, he doesn't want me to do that, but then they might do something equally as annoying. Yeah. Should we move on to the last one? Because the last one's a bit of a cracker and it might take a while. So, abandon ideology.
Well, this will tie into evil, won't it?
Yeah, a little bit. So the main sort of bit I got from it was this idea of when stuff becomes isms. So this is classic what we were saying a minute ago, where you just overly generalize things, but like the police force. So what you do is you get low resolution representations. Well, I think what he talks about here specifically is the idea of the economy, the nation, the environment, the patriarchy, the people, the rich, the poor, whatever. And they create very distinct categories that are very vague and highly complex. Yeah. Like, it's like the idea of putting all rich people into the same bracket, when you have within this bracket,
so
first of all, Well, yeah, because you have people who actually might actually deserve it in terms of they're actually changing the world and doing great things and being rewarded for it. But then you also have aristocratic stuff or sort of royalty-based stuff where it's just passed down from generation to generation. They're not doing fucking anything for it. But like that's it. This idea that when we have ideology, what we're doing is we're taking this idea, like a complex world, and reducing it to something that's simple. But you're abstracting away all the complexity and then thinking it's as simple as this v this. And then the problem is, what he talks about is the this v this mentality, a bit like evil in the evil book, leads to violence. Because the classic thing as well is if you do this v this, the side you're on, because of just the way humans are built, is always the side of the good. Because everybody believes they're good, even serial killers. So the general crux of the chapter was this idea that ideology leads to violence. Ideology is low resolution thinking. Ideology is reduction of complexity in the favor of simplicity for humans to sort of get behind each other and basically rile against an enemy. And it's essentially, it's never good. Like there is nothing good out of it because you can't even have a discussion.
You're essentially, like you just said, you're simplifying the world basically down to just you and your bubble. And that everything outside of that is not within your bubble. And so then you need to take your lens and apply it. And that's just how you see the rest of the world. You just see it through your lens and that everything has to be changed.
Yeah, and not even just that, like there's an enemy who's stopping it. Like the other side of people who believe the opposite are the people who are preventing, your utopia or your idea from spreading. Therefore you're in a world surrounded by enemies. So what do you do to enemies? You eradicate them. Yeah. Relatively. And because we, like I said in the other, and I still do believe what I said last time, which is like the idea that the idea of the adversary, and the idea of making people out to be really bad, is a way of getting social group cohesion to attack the people you want to. Like evil's almost like weaponized to then convince a group of people to take out another group of people because you can weaponize the concept of it.
Yeah, why would your army fight for you if
unless you have a perfect image of why would you fucking fight another country for the best people? Like, they're so nice. Like, can
you imagine trying to rile them up and be like, look, personally, I don't like them, but they're actually really good. Their economy is booming and,
Yeah, they're really nice people. Look at them all. They're all doing their gardening. Look at these old people over here. Like, they're really harmless. Let's go fucking...
I wonder what they said about, like, native Indians. Like, imagine it. It's like, it turns out that they eat the whole animal. They don't really take up much land. They're, like, really at peace with nature.
They probably, they probably basically made them out to, like, cannibals or something.
Yeah, savages. That's what it would be. Just nuts. It is a tool for basically... acquiring power in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, Peterson has always gone about, without even in this book, he's always against this sort of idea of ideology. But I guess there's not really much to say apart from the fact that he basically argues that it's not conducive to anything productive in human society. And I would probably agree with that, because the moment you believe something to be true without ever being able to change your mind is when you become, almost like a robot, but a defective robot who can only see things in a specific way and therefore can never change. And why would you ever not want to change when we already talked about this idea that the world is always changing? Yeah. So it's, to me, it's relatively obvious, but I can imagine for other people it might not be, just because they don't see it that way. They see it as if you are, got the ideology bug, you're like, oh, it's good or evil. Like, you're evil for even questioning the fact that what I say is true.
Well, this is it. And I think, a big point that I took away from evil that's also applicable to this is this idea of, creating a group around an ideal rather than around just, a kind of moral mapping and then putting your ideal on top.
No, it's always an ideal first, right?
Well, yeah, because if you have your ideal first, right, it acts as like a schema. And then you try to put on your morals. Only certain ones can filter into that schema, right? Which means then you can back up your ideal with certain morals and then just kind of reject the others, right? Whereas if you start with all of the morals, then your ideal has to adapt to that.
And I guess the end is never really moral. Like, do you get what I mean? Because moral is almost like a behavioral code of how to get somewhere. Yeah, it's a value. They're less. Yeah, people less care about that. They care more. The whole idea of the ideal is to get to this achieved state of utopia, or this harmonious state where everything is perfect.
Yeah.
And the moral code can be subsumed as long as you get there, and that is one of the main problems. Like any cost to get to the end goal, and you've seen how that's ended throughout history.
Yeah,
every time that's ever been. But I felt there was a really interesting video of Fauci, how do you pronounce his name, the other day, just saying he was like, oh, we live in a society, so you have responsibility to take away your liberties for the society because it's for the greater good.
Yeah,
and for the greater good is the worst phrase. I hate. Yeah. And sure, he has I get it. Like I really do get it. Like. But there is an idea of great. Good? Yeah, exactly. No, that's it. Who defines the greater good?
Yeah, exactly. And
that is the big problem. And that's not. Yeah, I don't mean. Trust me, I don't like him either. But for me, I get why if you're in power, you'd say that. Of course, I get his motives, and I get the concept of it.
Yeah,
I get why he does it. But at the same time, it's just that is exactly what everybody says to push their own agenda, because it's just like it's for the greater good. It's because I know what's best, so you guys got to do it.
What I think is dangerous now is that you end up having massive greater goods, like, okay, let's say save lives, right? Save the NHS, save lives, okay? I'm not saying that that's a bad one. And you've got save the environment or like reduce climate change. But you can't really argue against those goals, can you? Because they shouldn't be argued against.
It's a classic, because if you argue against his goals, you're immoral.
Exactly.
You don't care. You're a fucking psychopath.
But then if you use that goal to justify anything, then so many things can pass through. Like the amount of things that I've seen that is like, oh, we're doing this to save the planet, and they're not even correlated. Like it doesn't even make
the road to heaven is paved. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Isn't it? I still believe that to be the case always, because it's just like, of course, whenever you just spout a noble goal, everybody could be like, oh, that's great, that's fantastic. You go you. But it's like, there's difference between, I don't know, the methods of getting there as well, right?
The methods that take you there should be noble. Hence why, like,
relatively, yeah.
But isn't it ironic that you could create a world where you try to like create a moral landscape, and in order to do that, you could just be like, no, we want to make the world moral. So then you end up pushing through immoral terms.
Yeah,
in a sense.
Yeah. Well, I think that's I just don't see how you can ever get all these problems when you have like a bunch of 7 billion conflicting desired and like hairless apes, all trying to push their own relative agendas, because everybody has their own interests. So it's just, I just genuinely don't know how you're ever going to reconcile a whole entire society.
I don't think you ever will. I think
it's ever possible.
It's just constantly changing as well.
Yeah, and then this leads to nihilism, this leads to like selfishness, because then you'd be like, well, if that is the case, then why would I ever help anybody else out? So then that's like I was switching as well before, you end up, if you follow that pathway, you end up thinking, oh, nothing fucking matters, like it's all relative, so I might as well power grab what I can, because no matter what I do, nobody's ever going to reconcile it. But then you have the opposite side of things, where somebody would say the complete opposite way. It's all doable because we're all malleable. I don't know.
I think that's actually a pretty good thing to end on, because the next 6 rules are all about that, pretty much, aren't they?
Yeah,
nihilism and overcoming that.
Yeah, we can definitely touch on it again. Yeah, for sure, mate. Well, that was good. I'm excited for the next one.
All right. Well,
perfect. That's a wrap.
And that's a wrap.